In this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio,
Well, a lot of people, when they hear the word alchemy, tend to think of, at least in this day and age, coming from a sort of rationalist paradigm, tend to think of crazy alchemists in their laboratory trying to transmute lead into gold, the typical charlatan or the naive precursor to chemistry. And now we have chemistry, which is so much more advanced and we know so much more, and alchemy doesn't really matter anymore. But alchemy was always both a physical and a spiritual process, something that was happening externally in the alchemist's laboratory, but also reflected internally within their spiritual being, within their consciousness. And when I talk about creative alchemy, it's the same concept as an alchemist working in the laboratory and watching these various processes in matter unfold and transform and transmute. But instead, you're working with your creative process and watching that transmute as you're also observing transmutations within the self, within your soul.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, author, artist, and dare I say, alchemist, Marlene Seven Bremner returns to Rebel Spirit Radio to discuss her latest book, The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy, Imagination, Creativity, and the Great Work. Seven discusses how historical movements in art reflect the alchemical opus, the relation of chakras to alchemy, and why accessing our authentic creativity is how magic happens. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated.
Marlene Seven Bremner is a self-taught oil painter, writer, and teacher who has spent more than 20 years exploring esoteric and spiritual traditions, including Hermeticism, alchemy, surrealism, symbolism, tarot, psychology, magic, astrology, shamanism, and mythology. She developed her career as an artist in the Pacific Northwest and now spends her time painting and writing in the New Mexico desert. She is the author of Hermetic Philosophy and Creative Alchemy. She joins me today to discuss her latest book, The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy. Seven, welcome back to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
Well,
Glad to be back.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I loved that previous book. I got to tell you, I think that I like the new one a little bit more. I think it's just the alchemy, the alchemical aspect really speaks to me in many ways. But I wanted to ask you, I thought that we could start with this. The two books seem to be very related. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit. What is the relationship between the two books?
Well, originally, I had envisioned them as one book, one massive book, probably. But when I presented the idea to the publishers, they wanted me to break it up into two books. So I kind of pretty easily was able to see how that would happen, with a focus in the first book on the Hermetic tradition and sort of the history of Hermeticism and connecting that with alchemy and giving some basic alchemical theory, and then moving into a journey through the seven Hermetic spheres, which align with the seven traditional planets of astrology. And the second book then becomes more about the alchemical magnum opus, or great work. And because I broke it into two books, I was able to go a little deeper into some history in each book, which is just interesting to me and was fun to explore. So in the first book, that related to the history of Hermeticism specifically. And then in the second book, kind of a journey through these different periods of art in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as a sort of reflection of the alchemical process, and also to kind of, lay a foundation for how artists in these different periods have conceptualized the occult, how they've used alchemy as metaphor and in actual practice in their art and in other ways, and then to move into the actual alchemical work from there. And to be able to kind of reference art from those periods as examples of how people have experienced some of the different alchemical processes.
Yeah. I've got to say that the two books are a rich education in the Western esoteric tradition. And they're beautifully written and I think very accessible, but they are a nice compendium of Western esoteric thought. So if someone is looking for a background and something that is scholarly, but not, I don't know the word I want. I don't want to say scholastic, but, accessible, that they're accessible. I think that the two books, I would recommend them to anyone for that history. So you did a remarkable job. And I've read other books on alchemy, and I think that you address some things that other books don't. And I think that the making the connections with artwork really helps bring to life some of that alchemical process. So, since we're talking about the alchemical process, and you had mentioned some of the history of art, let's start with creative alchemy. And let me ask you, what is that? What is creative alchemy in this alchemical process?
Mm. Well, a lot of people, when they hear the word alchemy, tend to think of, at least in this day and age, coming from a sort of rationalist paradigm, tend to think of crazy alchemists in their laboratory trying to transmute lead into gold, the typical charlatan or the naive precursor to chemistry. And now we have chemistry, which is so much more advanced and we know so much more, and alchemy doesn't really matter anymore. But alchemy was always both a physical and a spiritual process, something that was happening externally in the alchemist's laboratory, but also reflected internally within their spiritual being, within their consciousness. And when I talk about creative alchemy, it's the same concept as an alchemist working in the laboratory and watching these various processes in matter unfold and transform and transmute. But instead, you're working with your creative process and watching that transmute as you're also observing transmutations within the self, within your soul. And through that, facilitating a union or a unified understanding of the internal and the external world, or the above and the below, spirit and matter. So creative alchemy then becomes a way of engaging with physical reality that is transformative and creative and also very spiritual.
Now, you wrote at the end of the book, I want to go back to all of this, but you wrote at the end of the book that this new book, The Hermetic Marriage of Art and Alchemy, and the previous one were born of your own journey. So you have gone through this alchemical process yourself. And I was wondering if you might be willing to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'll say from a young age, I was sort of preoccupied with the balance of the sun and the moon. And I was very artistic as a child as well. And often most of my drawings would involve nature, and the sun and the moon would always be there. And I wasn't really conscious of what this meant until much later in my life, but I became interested in natural healing and pursued training in this healing modality called polarity therapy. And I studied for about 5 years and practiced and learned so much about the esoteric anatomy of the body, the chakra system, the staff of Hermes within the body, the caduceus, and the interweaving serpents of the Kundalini energy. Right. And that was sort of my first introduction to Hermetic principles and to alchemy. And it just, really spurred my curiosity in those areas. And so I went further with it beyond my polarity therapy training. And at the same time, I had lost touch with my creative side. I sort of, written off artwork as a hobby, something that I just do on the side, not that important. But at this time in my life, it really came back to me, and I wanted to improve my skills in art. I wanted to become a good painter. So I began to teach myself oil painting. And at the same time, I went through a very, very dark night of the soul, and it lasted for several years. And nothing seemed to really make sense anymore. I was sort of thrust into a state of chaos within myself, a lot of repressed trauma coming up that I was having to deal with and face for the first time in my life, a lot of anxiety and fear and panic attacks. And I didn't really know how to handle it, even though I'd been training in natural healing and had studied different forms of meditation and practiced yoga. All these things didn't really seem to help at this time in my life. But through my interest in alchemy, I was introduced to the ideas of Carl Jung, and so kind of the psychological perspective on the alchemical art, and at the same time teaching myself how to oil paint. So what happened was I began to see how I could project these inner contents that I was having such a difficult time with onto the canvas and allow myself to just, kind of cathartically express what was going on within me, no matter how dark it was. And from there, gain information about what was actually happening and how I could integrate it and heal from it. So that was really the birth of the whole process, was the Nigredo, or the dark night of the soul, the beginning of the alchemical great work in my own life that lasted for a very long time. And the only thing that really seemed to pull me through it was, and from there, as my art developed and as I began to heal and integrate integrate my shadow side and sort of transform from this, I would say, naive spiritual perspective that I held beforehand to a more integrated one that allowed for there to be darkness within me, and to find the way to make that shadow side an ally rather than something that was working against me. From there, I began to see a much greater transformation begin to unfold. And this is what is considered the albedo, or the whitening, the next phase in the process, where the subjective and objective world for me the lines between became very blurred. And I felt a sense of transcendence and oneness with everything around me, almost to the point of megalomania, where you get in touch with that God essence within yourself, and you begin to see not only like the symbolic meanings hidden in just mundane and everyday things and in conversations with people, but also getting a sense for how our own consciousness influences that. And so it was a very liminal time for me, but also a lot of inspiration flooding in. And this is when I began to explore surrealist techniques of automatism, and really just allowing the rational mind to be put to the side and the unconscious contents to flow out onto the canvas without any sort of filter or control. And amazing things happened. I learned so much. And, as I would progress with the painting in that way, I would begin to see defined figures or shapes or forms, faces. And as they became more clear to me, then I would go in and refine them, bring out the detail and the realism. And I worked with that for a number of years. And I still include that practice in my creative process.
That sounds, not to interrupt, but that sounds a lot like what Jung did when he had his confrontation with the unconscious and created the Red Book, because, the Red Book's got all those fantastic paintings that he did at that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Jung, in order to reconcile the conflict with these unconscious parts of ourselves when they start to become conscious, he recommended working with mandalas. And I think symmetry works the same way, at least for me. Symmetry plays a big part in my art. And so there's that process of automatism, of exploring what's in the unconscious and letting it come out and coming to know it. And then for me, there's the integration. And that tends to take the form of symmetry and these kind of harmonious shapes and patterns, sacred geometry, as a form of integrating those contents and bringing them to a state of wholeness. And then, also being able to ascertain or distill the essence of a process that I've been going through, and then share it with other people that might also be undergoing a similar process.
Right. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask is that, I love this idea of the personal transformation being mirrored in the art, and that connection between art and the transformation of the self. And I wanted to ask, because this process, this alchemical process, it's not just for artists, I don't think. And I guess the question I wanted to ask you in that regard is, or is everyone an artist? Is going through that process, does that make everyone an artist of sense?
Personally, I think just being a human endows us with the power of creation, and we're all creative in different ways. We tend to think of artists in the typical sense of, someone who's creating something, a visual piece of art, a piece of music, a poem, a sculpture. but we're all being creative every single day.
Right.
And there's infinite ways that this plays out, from the way that we dress ourselves to the food that we cook to the activities that we engage in and the way that we interact with them. And I think it's really just a matter of being conscious of that creative capacity and applying it in the way that makes sense for you, whether that's with some sort of visual or musical art, or if it's just in your business or raising your child, whatever it is for you. Maybe it's in your garden,
Yeah.
we all have something.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was thinking back to when I was writing my dissertation, because that also seems to be that sort of alchemical process,
Oh
and it
yeah.
is transformative. And I spent a lot of time in the dark night of the soul. I'll just share this with you. Before we spoke, I was eating some yogurt and fruit and just kind of mindlessly looking at Facebook. And, sometimes they pop up the memories that you want to share. And the memory was me posting that I was starting to write my dissertation. This was like back in 2015. I'm like, I think I can do a page a day. So a year from now, I'll be done. And my first thought was, oh my goodness, how naive I was.
Yeah, a page a day is ambitious, actually.
Oh yeah. I finally graduated, I think in 2019. So it took a good 3.5 years or so. And it was definitely a dark night of the soul. I can tell you that. Um, but I really like this idea of everyone, our life is art in a sense. And it reminds me of, I think it was Neville Goddard, who talked about humans being created in the image of God. What that means is, God is creator, that we are creators, which seems to be what you were just saying. And the other aspect to all of this, I think, what's kind of key is the imagination. And you talk about the imagination, and you wrote that it's a divine faculty and the greatest gift of our human existence. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the imagination and the importance of the imagination in this work.
Yeah, well, I mean, artists, of course, understand the importance of the imagination, but it tends to have a sort of stigma of being unreal. It's just your imagination. You're just imagining things. That's just a fantasy, and it does have that aspect, the fantastical and kind of escapist aspect, or what we think of as like magical thinking in a negative sense. Not being grounded, in actual reality, in fact. And so with the Enlightenment, this kind of got really solidified as, the subjective world, the imaginary world, dreams, all of that happening on the inner world is really not that significant. And what we're interested in is fact and the scientific method and what's objective and verifiable, But this reclamation of the imagination I see is really pivotal, because really, like, even scientific breakthroughs and innovations, they all kind of begin in the imaginal world, which is the term that I refer to in the book, the imaginal world. Henry Cravan came up with that word to kind of counter our preconceptions of the word imaginary. So we can think of this as an actual place with real, valid information that we all partake in all of the time. And the way that I like to think about imagination is it's a faculty that we can refine and develop and perfect, both in a creative sense as artists or creators, but as also in the creation and transmutation of our own experience of reality, and that's where Neville Goddard comes in with the imagination as a way to manifest things, manifest our desires, and to change our experience. And so there's many different ways to think about the imagination, both in the generation of ideas, allowing that free flow of imaginative, association and stuff to occur so that we can reach into that unconscious part of ourselves and make sense of it and turn it into something beautiful, but also to consciously engage with the imagination in a way that we are facilitating real change in our lives. And, in a sense, when we recite affirmations or something like that, that's one way of kind of infusing our imaginal world with our intention.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I like this idea of reclaiming our imaginations, because I have, and I may have even said this to you in the previous interview, I don't recall, I apologize, but I know I've said it before on the podcast, is that I have often felt like my imagination has been colonized, that it's not necessary, what goes on is not necessarily mine. And I think that that's something that's very, it's instilled in us at a young age just because of the culture we live in. And if I understand correctly, part of this creative alchemical process is to deconstruct a lot of that. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and that actually comes into play in the first two stages of the great work, which is sort of one of the processes that I talk about in the Negredo chapter is putrefaction. So this kind of breakdown of our conditioned ideas and beliefs, and like you're saying, the colonization of the imagination, these things that have been sort of imposed on us by society, by our families and culture, and really breaking that down so that we can release anything that's sort of inhibiting our authentic creativity, what really wants to come through us in our own unique way. And in the second phase of the opus, one of the processes I talk about is dissolution. And this is another way that we can kind of break down and purify these different limiting beliefs that we have. So we could think of like a mental thought structure or a conditioned belief, a core belief, as like a cube, a salt crystal, right? And you throw that into water and it's going to dissolve and it's going to become one with the water. So if we can kind of release these core beliefs that we hold that are like really solid and fixed into a greater body of awareness and kind of tap into something greater than ourselves and connect with that, then we evaporate the water and we're left with a crystal again, but it's in a more purified state. So that's that integration of what we perceive in that sort of watery, unconscious fluidity where we let go of these fixed concepts and then we integrate it again and come to a new understanding or wisdom, the salt of wisdom, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but isn't it scary because we have these ideas and these mental constructs that you mentioned, we're conditioned. And you wrote that all of this has to die, and that's kind of like this ego death. It's this death of everything that you thought you were.
Oh yeah, it can be terrifying. I mean, that's why it's called the dark night of the soul, right?
Yeah.
That confrontation and also, just letting go of something that has kind of defined us.
Right.
And the ego death can be absolutely terrifying and leave us feeling like a shell of ourselves, kind of. There's a great alchemical engraving, I think it's in the book, of an alchemist like huddled in a sort of dry valley, and his spirit and his soul have been separated from him, and he's just, got his arms crossed over his chest and huddled there in this sort of depraved state. And that's very like emblematic of this stage of the process. It can be really intense and disheartening. And I think what I want to bring light to and what I try to emphasize in the book is that if we can look at that as just part of the process, and not only just part of it, but the beginning of it, it transforms it immediately, If we just have a context for it and don't become so identified with that sense of loss and death and isolation. But seeing it as a necessary turning inward that's going to eventually transform, especially if we kind of can embrace it to a certain degree.
Yeah. Now, you may not have an answer, but I'm going to ask this question anyway. With the Negredo and this dark night of the soul, is this something that is just going to happen to an individual? Or is it something that because I don't know how many people would consciously say, yes, I'm going to go into the dark night of the soul now.
Yeah, I think it's different for different people. Some people are just melancholic by nature, very Saturnian by nature. And so they may just have this kind of general Negredo experience throughout their life. And maybe sometimes they come out of it and then they go back into it. Or, with depression, people go in and out of it. But I think a lot of times it's catalyzed by a loss, a big change in our life, either the
Yeah.
loss of a loved one or someone important to us, loss of a job, divorce, these kind of big changes that happen where there's a little death that we kind of have to endure, or an actual death
Right.
that we have to grieve and process. So it really just depends. And, for me, with my dark night of the soul, it sort of was a combination of both.
Okay.
Because I sensed that there was something inside of me that needed to be broken open. And so I was walking around with this mantra, like, I need to be shattered,
Right.
which is crazy to me to think about, but I really was.
Yeah.
And so then I called in this experience, which I've talked about many times with DMT. It's the only time I've ever tried it. And I was basically, it was complete ego dissolution. I was thrust into a completely different reality that was just cold and chaotic. And I had no sense of who I was, where I had come from. It was just the awareness of this, what felt like an eternity of chaos. And it really did shatter me. It was such a disruption to my understanding of what reality was. And it was so real that the panic and the fear came in, because I felt suddenly that this reality, consensus reality that's so comforting, or not, could just be ripped away from me at any moment. And so certain things that reminded me of that liminal experience of going into the DMT would trigger panic attacks. And it all centered, interestingly, around the root chakra, which is ruled by Saturn. I talk about this in the book. It's ruled by Saturn, and it relates to the earth element. And Saturn is the quintessential planet of the Nigredo, the dark night of the soul, or of melancholy. So that was my experience. I was actively calling in the dark night of the soul, even though I didn't really know what I was getting myself into.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of things along those lines is, one, I was actually thinking about this process in terms of ayahuasca ceremony, which is DMT, and that quite often people have that kind of dark night of the soul when they have that experience. And the goal of all of that is for the integration of what you learn throughout the experience. And so, so I'm glad that you brought the DMT experience up, because I could see that in the ayahuasca experiences.
Yeah. And I think these sort of visionary experiences or initiations, or like people that go and engage with the Sundance, these intense initiations, I'll say, are ways that we can sort of facilitate that Nigredo experience when we're ready for it, hopefully.
Yeah. And that's something I'm thinking about a lot, is initiation, and kind of a global initiation, because I have the sense that we are in the dark night of the soul now. Kind of. Here's the other thing I was going to mention. As I was going through your book, I would make notes in the side of tarot cards and see if I could find comparisons. And you talk about some of the tarot cards, but I think that the best tarot card for Nigredo is the Tower.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's that shock from the outside, and I think that's where we are now. I think that we haven't even gotten into the full dark night of the soul. The Tower's there, things are starting to fall apart, and it's that falling apart is a dismemberment.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's something that's been coming up in other conversations I've been having, is that we are currently experiencing the first stage of the alchemical opus, the Nigredo. And that part of that is the dissolution and the sort of breakdown of these societal structures that we've become so accustomed to, rooted in the patriarchy, that are kind of breaking down. And that's totally necessary for something new to be birthed. But it's a painful process, and it's scary. And a lot of us are scared, especially with what's happening with the ecosystems and the environment and global warming and all of the increase of storms and the increased temperatures and all of that. It's quite terrifying, just as the Nigredo is described to be, as an internal experience or an individual level. But now we're going through that collectively. And with the fires and stuff, it's really interesting to think about calcination as an alchemical process, which relates to the Tower card, as you said, because it's a Mars process related to the sign of Aries in the zodiac. So the tower goes along with that.
Right.
And yeah, just this sort of cataclysmic fire that is burning everything down to ashes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to me that the holding on to these structures that are the root cause for, these ecological crises that we're facing, and also social justice crises.
Right.
We seem to be holding on to them just like people hold on to their conditioning.
Oh yeah.
So I think that there's an amazing connection between the alchemical work, the work of the individual, and what's going on in the larger world here. Yeah. And so the other thing that keeps coming up in conversations that I have is I've had several guests say, well, we have to remember who we are. And that's what got me thinking about this whole process, because I was thinking about that sort of shamanic initiation where the shamans have that experience sometimes of, figuratively, symbolically being dismembered.
Yeah.
And that's how I keep thinking about this, is in the sense that we are being dismembered and then we have to remember ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually that goes back to the very ancient roots of alchemy in Egypt and the whole mythology around Osiris,
Right.
the dying and resurrected god who is dismembered by his evil brother Set. And then his loving spouse and sister Isis has to go about and collect all those dismembered pieces and put them back together and remember Osiris, remember the body of Osiris. And through that, the phallus is still missing. She recreates the phallus through magical means and then conceives a child. So through that whole death and resurrection process, something new and redeeming is born.
Right.
And yeah, that's the shamanic experience. Exactly.
Yeah. So we are in the alchemical process, whether you like it or not. And it helps to have a guide. It helps to have a guide to what's going on, what's happening. And, I liked kind of going back, because there are some other things I want to talk about, but kind of going back just for a moment about art being transformative. And I have a quote here because I kind of see the larger culture being described here. Because you wrote, if we are not being transformed, if our art is not itself transforming as much as it is transformative, then we run the risk of art becoming vapid and hollow expression of some perverted obsession, or distorted by our desire for fame and fortune, repeating formulas that promise external success at the expense of true inner liberation and authenticity. And when I read that, I could not help but to think of popular culture and art in popular culture, especially like movies, and how formulaic they are. And it's all about the money.
Yeah. It's sad to see that, and a lot of people are content with that formulaic approach and way of storytelling, especially in media. But also I think about social media in general and just the shortening of attention spans. And we have no patience to really take anything in anymore. We see an image, like, scroll past, it's really sad the way that that's affecting us and limiting our ability to observe and be with art,
Right.
and also with COVID and kind of the isolation and everybody staying home, kind of, turning away from interactions with other people, interactions with art, and having art shows and stuff like that to go to and interact with. That's all been, I think, pretty detrimental, but we can all in our own ways kind of work against that, by taking more time with things, taking more time in our observations, being more thoughtful in how we take in media, more discerning in what we take in. And then in our creative process, not falling into the trap of materialism and the fear that is driven into us, that if we're not like constantly producing art and, sticking to a brand and all of that, that we're going to fail, because I think when we really access our authentic creativity and we let that be the driving force of our art and our business as an artist or as a creator of any kind, really, that's where the magic happens. And that's where the universe really comes to meet us. and help us realize our dreams.
Yeah. Yeah. The person that came to mind when you were discussing that in the book was David Lynch. That, I know that his process is he meditates. He's all about transcendental meditation, and he lets the imagery come to him, and he won't do anything unless it is an authentic arising from his unconscious, from his creativity. The one time he went off of that was when he made Dune, which everyone's like, yeah, that's the worst thing he's done. But ever since then, he's like, no, I'm always going to be authentic and true to myself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there's no one else quite like him in the world of film and art. So, and I definitely see the value of that. Let's talk about art a little bit more, because you do begin the book by discussing some, I guess, movements within art. You begin with Romanticism, and then I think it's the symbolism, Dada, and then you end with Surrealism. Speaking of David Lynch. And it occurred to me when I was reading them that in a way, those movements the history of it seemed to also mirror this creative alchemical process. Is that true? Am I seeing things, or am I on the right path there?
Yeah, totally. I kind of, because I went through 4 movements, which was a choice. I could have expanded beyond that. I could have looked at medieval art or Renaissance art, but I really wanted to look at these specific periods because I think they do mirror that alchemical opus in a way. Beginning with Romanticism, which was kind of a reactionary movement to the Enlightenment era values that relegated these subjective realms to insignificance, And so it was a reassertion of the primacy of the individual and the subjective world of feelings and imagination and dreams. And also with the connection with nature and with the feminine. So in a sense, that Enlightenment shift could be seen as a sort of nigredo or a dying of the imagination, because, we wanted to leave behind these sort of naive, superstitious ways of relating to reality to reach something less dogmatic, and
yeah, what is it? The sleep of reason breeds monsters, or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Romanticism, I guess, sort of relates to that first stage of the process of like breaking that down and getting in touch with something more authentic and true to like what's actually happening inside the individual. And then from there, symbolism developed later in the 19th century and shares a lot of similarities with Romanticism, an interest in Eastern, more exotic ideas, Gothic architecture, alchemy, magic, things of the past, this sort of romantic idea of things of the past and bringing that into the art that they were creating. But the symbolists really went pretty deep into that dark world of the unconscious, I think, which is reflective of that second stage of the alchemical opus, which is very watery, very lunar, getting in touch with the feminine, what's hidden, what's underneath the surface, kind of losing yourself in this sort of escape into the imaginal world. And for the symbolists, that was enough. They just wanted to escape into that imaginal world, create art from it. But, they really went into that, especially with the end of the 19th century and the decadence and a lot of intoxication. And yeah. But then, with the 20th century came Dada and Surrealism. And so there was another sort of shift where people wanted art to say something, to like make a statement, and that it wasn't enough to just escape into this sort of intoxicated reality. And with Dada, it was a complete negation of art, kind of a breakdown of everything that we think about art to reformulate it. And so like a kind of destructive principle. And you get to the third stage of the opus, there's a few different things that happen. It's a transition to the final stage, but there can also be another sort of mini nigredo within that third stage, another sort of depth. And I see Dada like that, that was a necessary breakdown of concepts and ideas around art that needed to happen. And so they were very focused on creating things by chance and spontaneity and not needing to make sense. Their poetry without words, like just these sort of vocalizations, these sound incantations that they related to alchemy and magic. And surrealism was birthed within the Dada movement. It was very connected to it, but it became its own thing because the surrealists then sort of align with the final stage of the opus, which is the integration, like the complete integration of the opposites. And they were really interested in alchemy, really interested in psychology, as well as, Freud's ideas were taking hold, and the union of the subjective and objective, the union of the conscious and the unconscious, and using techniques to, like automatism, automatic writing, automatic drawing, to access the unconscious and allow it to flow freely. And so hence we get that very, iconic surrealist art, which is so interesting and not like you would think of classical art. So in that sense, the surrealists were very much in alignment with that final stage of union. And they even used a lot of alchemical metaphors, and a lot of them were writing about alchemy. Like Andre Breton writes about alchemy quite a bit, Max Ernst as well. And yeah, but for them, it was that union, that place of union was something that was inherent in reality. And it was just a matter of getting back to it. Not something new that was being created, but more of like stripping away all the falsity to get back to that place of unity.
Yeah. Yeah. Surrealism has always been sort of my favorite art form. And I don't know exactly why. And maybe it is because it is that dream in reality merger. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love your artwork so much, because I would say that your art is surrealist, and very alchemical, in there. And I just love surrealism. So I wanted to ask you about, you've mentioned this a couple of times, and it's come up a little bit here as well, nature and the feminine. And I was curious if you could speak a little bit about the role of the feminine in this alchemical process.
Well, the feminine we can relate to sort of the receptive side of our being. So we all have a masculine and feminine side of our being, and how we identify doesn't really matter so much. We all have these two parts, in various proportions. And the feminine just tends to relate more to the receptive, passive, less active side of our being, also to the unconscious or what's hidden, the lunar side. In alchemy, it's Luna and Sol. So the solar side relating to the sun and to the active aspect of our consciousness, the rational part of our being. And these two work in harmony together, ideally. Usually the case is that they're sort of constantly battling each other.
Right.
And so in alchemical art, you see a lot of like animals representing these two polarities battling each other, or you see the king and the queen as representations of Sol and Luna, and their sort of various iterations of separation and conjunction as mirroring a process that goes on within the individual as they're coming to reconcile these two parts of their being. And yeah, so the feminine I would relate to that more inner world.
Yeah.
The world of feelings and imagination and subjective, and which has been so suppressed by the patriarchy.
Yeah. And that's what we have to retrieve, right? And it's necessary for our imagination and to be creative beings and remember ourselves. We have to retrieve the feminine. And that's why I think it's so important. And I love that it's not one overcoming the other or overpowering the other, but it's supposed to be a union. It's supposed to be a kind of balance.
Yeah. I think at various parts of the process, Sol might overpower Luna, or Luna might overpower Sol, but ultimately the ideal is that union of these two parts.
Yeah. So I was also interested that I know in the first book, you talked about the planets quite a bit, and they appear a little bit in this book, but I think what's present a little bit more are the chakras. And what exactly is the connection between the chakras and alchemy?
Well, in the first book, I talk about Hermeticism, and a big part of the Hermetic path is this sort of Neoplatonic idea of the 7 spheres of the planets, these 7 nested spheres that we all are sort of born into. And as we incarnate into physical reality, we pass through these spheres and we take on different energies of these spheres. That if we look at it psychologically, these energies are forces that determine our fate. So there's sort of unconscious forces working on us, and they fall into 7 archetypal patterns that the 7 planets represent, or the 7 spheres. And in the Indian tradition, the 7 chakras are within the subtle body. And so it's interesting. I want to do some research around this, but around the caduceus specifically, and the connections between different cultures, because in the Indian tradition, the caduceus, the staff of Hermes, is mapped onto the subtle body. And where the 2 serpents of the staff of Hermes intertwine, that's where the chakras are located, these 7 points along the spinal column and leading up to the crown chakra at the top of the head. But these can also be related to those 7 planets and these 7 very archetypal patterns of energy that play out in our lives in different ways. So, like I said before, Saturn relates to the root chakra, the sun relates to the crown chakra, and there's variations on that system. You know, some people ascribe different planetary attributions to each chakra, and that's okay. I think different systems are totally valid. I like the one that I work with, and that's what I present in books. But it's just a way of understanding how the above affects the below. So how the celestial influences affect us internally in our subtle body, and in turn, how that subtle body affects our physical body, how it affects our consciousness and our unconscious. And the more conscious that we can become of that, the more we can gain agency over our own fate. And I talk about that more in the first book, these ideas of fate and the planets as these sort of rulers of fate. But when it comes to working with the chakra system, it's just a way of sort of bridging the inner and the outer world and understanding how these energies affect us and how they play out. Because often if we're dealing with some sort of physical issue, you know, we can relate that to something on the subtle level, to a chakra that rules that part of the body. And then we can look at the planet and we can look at that aspect of our life, you know. Like for me, when I was having my panic attacks, you know, it all centered around the root chakra. All the energy would flood there, and it was just this really intense feeling. And that led me to kind of look into Saturn as the ruler of the root chakra and the earth element, and think about, like, how can I create more structure in my life, more routine that's going to help me stay grounded and in my body? How can I heal this? And, you know, I observed other physical symptoms that went along with that. And if we look at all these different parts, it's a way that we can get a holistic view of something that's going on. It's not just a physical symptom, it's also reflected in patterns in our life, perhaps in our relationships too.
Yes. So, I was curious because I know that the chakra system is very focused on energy, and the alchemical system seems to be more about what's going on in consciousness, in a sense. But I like the idea of the 2 of them working together, that there is kind of a healing of the energetic body, and in conjunction with working with finding that balance within our own consciousness.
Yeah. Well, it all goes together, right? Because those 2 serpents, Ida and Pingala in the Indian tradition, represent the feminine and the masculine, or the passive and receptive side of our being. And as that Kundalini energy rises and comes to union in the third eye and at the crown, the energy is harmonized within our being. All the chakras are sort of aligned in this vertical alignment. The 2 sides of our being come to balance. And there's that enlightening effect of that kiss of the serpents in the third eye. And it's mirrored in the psychological process as well. So I don't really see that much of a distinction between the psychological, the energetic, the physical. It all comes together, you know?
Yeah. Well, it has to be holistic, I think, in order for it to have the power that it needs to have to heal us.
Yeah.
Know? Yeah. So thank you for that, because I'll be honest, you have a lot of correspondence charts in the books, which I think are an incredible resource that people can use for ritual and whatnot. In the chakra, and I'm still kind of learning about the chakras. I had some physical issues about a year ago, and it was clearly energetic as well. And I had gone to like a acupuncturist, and he didn't speak very much English, but he was like, "Your energy, oh," I'm like, "Yes, that's right." And a good friend of mine's a massage therapist, and she was holding it over the chakras, and she's like, "Your chakra, they're all blocked. Everything's blocked." And so I've done a lot of work to kind of clear things up. But as I was going through your book and you had the chakra charts, and kind of like, if everything's working right, this is it. But if it's blocked, I'm like, oh yeah, that's all me right there. That's what I was experiencing. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Were you
Yeah.
able to kind of look at the physical symptoms that you were having and relate it to things that were going on in
Oh
your
yeah.
life? Or
Oh yeah, yeah. It was actually pretty clear, and I've gone, I've done that a lot, and I've also talked about this. What really made the connection for me was about 8 years ago, when I was writing that I was going to finish my dissertation. My parents both passed away that year, and my dad he'd been sick for a while, and he kept having like congestive heart failure, and what they wanted to do was a surgery. They wanted to remove his pericardium, the sac that his heart sits in, because they said it had calcified, and that wasn't allowing the heart to beat properly. And they said, well, if we get rid of that sac, it'll beat properly, you'll be fine. Now, my dad was career Army, and he served, I think, 2 tours in Vietnam, never spoke about it. So I am convinced that my father had a lot of trauma from that. And I think it manifested in his heart. And I mention all of this because my brother, at the exact same time, got sick. And he ended up several months later having the same surgery that my dad had. He had the pericardectomy. And I remember, because he spent a month in the hospital and they were trying to figure out what in the world's going on. And my brother, without getting into all the personal history, my brother was around my parents far more than I was. And they lived in the same city. They were just, down the road from each other. So they were much more present. And I remember talking to my sister-in-law when he was going through all these tests. And I'm like, I think it's not, I didn't like the word psychosomatic, but it was like there's, because it's not all in his head, but there's a connection going on. And I started thinking about that. That's when I really started thinking about the connection between the energy and our emotions and how it manifests in our body. And when I did my first ayahuasca ceremony, I did it because I wanted to work on the energy, and it was all focused on my heart. Everything was focused on the heart. And so I didn't have the same experience, fortunately, as my brother did, but I recognized that there was this connection between the 3 men in the family and the inability to express something in the heart. So, yeah, so that's my answer to that.
yeah, that's so interesting and poetic too, the way the body expresses things, right? The hardening of the heart.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Oh,
the image I had was a cactus.
mm,
It was a cactus covered with the spines, and I realized that that was my heart. That all the um, disappointments and the losses and the heartaches, I had protected it, and that what I need to do is start pulling out all of those spines so that my heart can be open and free, and the energy can flow.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And, in the process, I think when we do that kind of work, we can honor that part of us that felt the need for
yeah,
that protection,
yeah, yeah,
yeah, and hold
yeah,
that close too.
yeah.
But
But it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, to start thinking like this and to start catching these things, because that's so much a part of the work, right?
yeah, I mean, it can take a long time to kind of break down our conditioned way of seeing reality and the
Yeah.
separation that we tend to view things with, like, oh, that's my body, that's
Right.
my emotional experience, that's my, external life, that's my career. We tend to kind of compartmentalize everything
Right.
rather than looking at the whole. But that's not really how things work. There's always a sort of synergy between the inner and the outer,
Mm.
and whether we're conscious of it or not.
Yeah.
But the more consciousness we bring to it, the more we can make those connections and facilitate healing. And yeah, I think there's something too in the story that you just told about generational trauma. It's really up to us always in our own life to heal that instead
Yeah.
of carrying it forward or letting
Yeah.
it through our own flowering and progression and
Yeah.
the spiritual sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's difficult to do that. And that's the other thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is ancestral traumas, in the sense of, we get them from just being raised in a family, but there's also a genetic component sometimes to these things.
Yeah.
We all have healing to do. We all have massive, massive healing to do. And so you go through this alchemical process, and then you're done. You're enlightened.
Yep.
Is that the way it works?
Yep. It's all good now. No, really, I see it as a cyclical
Mm.
process. And this is even talked about in the alchemical, the final stage. You've got the philosopher's stone. It's impervious to fire. You've perfected it. It still goes through another level of refinement. And that entails going through the whole process again, but in a more consolidated, faster way.
Right.
So the way I see it is like the Negredo still comes up for me. It came up for me when I finished the books, both of them, because I finished them at different times. And each time it was like a loss, because this project that I had been putting all of my heart and soul into, that had sort of defined my life every single day, working on the books in some regard, was suddenly no longer necessary. It was done, out of my hands. I couldn't do anything anymore. So yeah, there was a sense of loss in the same way that someone would feel that when their child leaves home for the first time to go off to college or something, a void. And that void is kind of similar to the void at the beginning of creation, right? The chaos at the beginning of creation, that darkness. So I had to go through that. But because I've gone through it so many times and also gone through it in such a dramatic way when I was younger, I recognize it for what it is. I can sort of embrace it and say, all right, I'm just going to surrender to this. I'm not going to try to like push through this. I know there's something here for me. I'm going to rest and just wait until the inspiration comes through. But it can take a while, but for me now, I've been through it so many times, it tends to go faster. And it's not so intense. I don't become identified with it. I don't get stuck in the way of thinking that it's always going to be like that.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's good news. That it might take less time as you go through it, but it is an ongoing process. We're going to go through this our entire lives, right?
It's life and death. It's a continuous cycle. They're totally connected, and life's generates that as just two parts of this reality that we're having to deal with. Things go a lot smoother.
Yeah,
there's more grace involved.
Yeah. And isn't that the symbol of the Ouroboros? Isn't that what that symbolizes? Is that it's constantly
the end
constantly
isn't
going.
eternally. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about one of the other alchemical images, because it's one that has always fascinated me, and it's the salamander in the fire. And what is that? What does that represent?
Well, the salamander represents the philosopher's stone, because the stone, once it's perfected, is said to be impervious to the flames. You can't dissolve it. You can't burn it. It's very solid and fixed. And the salamander represents that as being related to fire, as being seen as living in the fire in a magical sense. And I can't remember exactly where that stems from. I think it might be because the salamanders would scurry out from the wood pile when the fire began, or something like that.
Yeah.
There's some association there, because salamanders are actually very watery.
Right.
But as a symbol, they represent that ability to withstand the fire. And so I think that's the other thing that happens when you go through this process. You begin to refine this power within yourself, this awareness, which we can relate to the Philosopher's Stone, that becomes more and more solid the more we expose it to this process. And so to be impervious to the fire is to be able to withstand the conflagrations of life that we have to go through, these transformative initiative experiences, and to hold on to that spiritual essence at the core of our being, the immortal essence, what's really true within us. And everything else can be burned away, but if we can hold on to that essence, that's what that represents, the salamander and the fire.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I don't have any tattoos, but I have been thinking about getting one. And I was thinking for a long time that I want to get the salamander in the fire.
That would be a really good one. Yeah, that would be really good.
Yeah. Because I'm always concerned because it's so permanent and I change my mind so often, but I think I can stick with that one.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a good one. So I know that we're starting to run out of time here a little bit, but I want to go back to something that you wrote at the very beginning of the book about this entire process. And you wrote that the heart of alchemy is the search for divine love and unity. And I get the unity because we talked about that with the balance between the masculine and the feminine, the conscious and the unconscious. But what about this divine love?
Well, that divine love between those parts of our being, right? So the divine love that allows us to embrace the shadow, to hold the shadow with a feeling of love and tenderness, and also the love that is the unifying force within the universe. So if we think about, I think it was Empedocles, the philosopher, who talked about love and strife as being the two primal forces of the universe, constantly interacting with each other, and where strife tends to cause separation, love brings the union. And in alchemy, there's a similar philosophy, the axiom of solve et coagula, dissolution and coagulation. So the breaking apart and the bringing together. And that bringing together is the love of alchemy, and the search for that, and the bringing together of these disparate parts of the self, the coagulation of the self into a whole unified being.
Yeah, I always found it interesting to go back to the tarot for a second, the two cards that represent the solve and coagulas, the solve, that's the tearing apart, is the lover's card. And you would think that would be the card that is the bringing together, but it's not. It has the image of the sword. I know in some of the decks it's the cleaving apart, and it's the temperance or art card. If you're in the Thoth deck, it's an art card that's the bringing together.
Yeah, well, there's different ways of ascribing the tarot to the alchemical processes and to the zodiac too, but the system that I talk about in the book, the lovers, is actually, it relates to Gemini, and the alchemical process associated with that is fixation. And that has to do with that union of the opposites and the final integration and bringing together of them so that they're in a solid, fixed, final union.
What would be the solve card then in the system that you're?
That would be, I believe, Cancer, and the sign of Cancer, and that relates to the 7, the chariot.
Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of like the hero's quest, going out and search for the grail,
Yeah.
Hero in their chariot.
Yeah. Well, I know in Crowley's Thoth deck, the charioteer is holding what he says is the grail. It's the whole of the grail.
A chalice with a crab in it, I believe, right?
Right. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. I love how everything is so interconnected once you start digging into this Western esoteric tradition. And I think, again, you did an amazing job of explaining it and presenting it in a way that is so very accessible. So again, I applaud you on that. So, I guess we're kind of at the end here. Let me ask you, what are you going to do next? You finish these books. Are you going back into the Negrito? Or where
Well,
are you at? What's going on? What's
I was in
happening?
the Negrito for a little while, a couple months, I think, of just kind of like, all right, what's gonna happen next? I need something to focus on. And I was getting back into the studio, but I like to have a writing project along with the painting that I do. It's just part of my process to be able to integrate things intellectually and like, make sense of them in a sort of structured way through writing. Whereas the painting is much more of a soulful kind of expression. So I have been really inspired by the 36 astrological decans of the zodiac. So it's, each zodiac is broken down into 10-degree segments. So there's 3 in each zodiac sign, and they've all been ascribed with different planetary rulers. So it's kind of like a different lens of looking at the zodiac. And these decans have been used in magical systems for centuries. And there's many different descriptions of magical images that are associated with the decans. And there's also different systems of planetary rulership and different written descriptions. So what I'm doing is kind of a year of research on the decans. And for each decan, as it approaches, I write a post on my Patreon, going into all the research that I've done, describing the different ways of envisioning the decan, working with the decan, relating it to the tarot. And because some of the, like the Rider-Waite deck, a lot of those images are very much based in these decanic, at least for the minor arcana,
right,
based in these decanic images. So yeah, I'm writing a post, offering a few suggestions for how to work with it as it passes, as the sun passes through it. And then, yeah, we'll see how the project develops, but I could see it leading to a book. I think I'd like to spend another year making art for each of the decans, and we'll see. But that's kind of what I'm doing right now. And people can join me on Patreon for $1 a month if they want to read the posts.
All right. And what's your the Patreon website?
It's patreon.com/7art, all spelled out.
7art. Okay. And you also have a personal website, correct?
I do. Yeah. And that's just Marlene7Bremner.com.
All right.
And you can see all of my art in my gallery. There's links to the books and where different places you can purchase the books. And also lots of prints for sale. Most of my paintings are available as a print. So
yeah, wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I look forward to whatever you do with the decans. I'm a little bit familiar with them, but I would love to know what your take is on them. I think that would be fascinating.
yeah, it's a fascinating subject. I'm having a lot of fun.
Yeah. It's in the Picatrix, right? Isn't that one of the sources?
That's one of the sources. Yeah. There's a couple Hermetic sources, some Arabic sources. There's a whole Indian system of decanic descriptions.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And I know that there's a decan walk that you can take with the tarot where you kind of focus on the card for the decan, which I should probably do at some point. That would be interesting. All right. Well, Seven, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and thoroughly enjoyed the conversation again. And one final time, appreciate your work and highly recommend it to everybody.
Thank you so much, Nick. It was really lovely to talk to you again. And I just appreciate being back on the show and your kind words about my work and the books. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
And that's a wrap on episode 103 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're part of my YouTube audience. For anyone who would like to support my work here on Rebel Spirit Radio, and please support my work, please consider joining my Patreon. Some of the perks for patrons include early access to videos, shout outs to members, a members-only Facebook page, access to the Rebel Spirit Radio Discord server, and a monthly book club where we explore books discussed on the podcast, spiritual and philosophical classics, and books related to the cocktail apocalypse. I mean, remember, I am a professor of religious studies and philosophy, so consider the book club an ongoing classroom where you can go as deep as you want with me and other Rebel Spirits. Patreon has also started a free membership tier, so I'll be posting quite a bit of material on the Patreon site that is available to everyone. So please take a moment to sign up. You can find the link for the Patreon in the show notes or video description. And of course, if you would prefer to make a one-time donation, you can still do so via PayPal. I still have a lot of big plans for the podcast and the YouTube channel. Right now, this is all a labor of love. So your support will not only help me in continuing what I've been doing here, but will also help me grow the channel and the podcast. I will be tremendously grateful for any support that you can provide. Another way that you can help the podcast is to share it with friends, family, coworkers, social media. You know the drill. That really is one of the best ways that you can help and support the podcast. Help me grow my audience. As I always like to say, I'm here in the front range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality, and ecology, psychedelics, and consciousness, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and I sure do hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me share the good news. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. It only takes a second, and your 5-star ratings really do help, especially if you listen on Apple. If you have a minute to spare, please consider posting a short but positive review. And please subscribe. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.